Today's lecture is going to focus on the Constitution by means of two major concepts: the establishment of a bicameral legislature and federalism. You may have learned in U.S. history about the reason that we have a bicameral legislature. Our bicameral legislature has two branches, chambers, or houses. You can hear those terms interchangeably, and they all mean the same thing. That makes up our legislative body. Our Congress is set up with the House of Representatives and the Senate, and this was the result of the Great Compromise. Originally, the plans were known as the New Jersey Plan and the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan based representatives on the basis of population. That's where we get the House of Representatives. The greater the population, the more representation there is in this chamber. When we look at the Senate, however, this was to ensure that smaller states were still represented. The New Jersey Plan, New Jersey, which is a smaller state, ensured that 2 senators would be voted into the Senate from each state. A major way larger states tried to increase their populations was by counting each of their slaves as 3/5 of a person. This increased the population count, but as we know, slaves were not represented within government. When bills are passed, they go through several steps in Congress, and there are many ways in which both chambers of Congress check one another. But let's first look at why the framers created a bicameral legislature. Well, first, we're looking at the compromise at the Constitutional Convention. We're looking at the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise. This appeased large and small states, as I mentioned before on the previous slide. The Virginia Plan met the New Jersey Plan, and the Virginia Plan appeased larger states in representation, and the New Jersey Plan appeased smaller states in representation. The representation enjoyed by smaller states was a way of protecting the minority interests to prevent majority tyranny. Many states were very fearful of a strong central government, particularly smaller states, knowing that the greater populations of larger states may have a disproportionate amount of influence in creating policies that have to be adhered by the entire country. Another reason was to slow down the policymaking process. Keep in mind, laws are made at the local level as well as the state level, so we're just looking at slowing down the process at the federal level. In order to pass a law, a bill has to pass through both chambers of Congress with a majority. After that, the president can either veto the law or sign the bill into action or law. If the president vetoes the law, it can still go back to both chambers of Congress. And if they can manage to get 2/3 of both chambers to push the bill forward, then that overrides the presidential veto. If they do not, the presidential veto kills the bill and it does not become law. Many people are very frustrated with this process because it can seem as though or appear as though Congress is inefficient and ineffective. A lot of you may agree with that. However, this actually may be a purposeful intent, meaning that it serves well for branches to check one another. Doesn't necessarily mean that these laws cannot be passed. Laws can be passed at the local and state level, but it might be a way of preventing the federal government from being able to impose too many laws and become too tyrannical. However, where Americans tend to get most frustrated is when certain programs are not funded because Congress can't agree or compromise. Let's take a look at some of the exclusive powers of the House and the Senate. First, let's take on the House. The House is able to initiate revenue bills, so all money bills have to go through the House first. They call this the power of the purse. What this means is when we're looking at representation, there are a lot more representatives that represent many districts throughout the country. They're closer to the people. If the people are unhappy with how they're handling money, they get voted out more frequently because they're voted in every 2 years. Also, if the Electoral College fails, meaning that a candidate is unable to secure 270 electoral votes, then the House of Representatives gets to choose the president. Again, the House is considered closest to the people and closest to local communities. So the House is seen as a better chamber to dictate who that president ought to be and represent the people. The House also has the power to impeach. What this means is the House can place formal accusations before an elected official. In this case, we're talking about the president. And it doesn't mean that that individual is convicted or is going to be kicked out of office. What it means is that a trial will take place to be able to assess whether or not that individual ought to be convicted. Let's recap why the House has this power. Remember, they're closer to the people. There are more of them. This is because there are more local communities they represent, more districts they represent. They're more responsive to their constituency as well, especially since they face re-election every 2 years. And so it is common to see these individuals more frequently. They often go to major events in the districts that they represent, and they visit many different people. The individuals pictured here are Ami Bera and Doris Matsui. Doris Matsui is my representative as I reside in Sacramento, and Ami Bera is your representative because you reside in Folsom. What's interesting is Folsom tends to be regarded as more of a conservative city. However, Ami Bera is a Democrat. So many have seen this district to be highly contested. And when we look at Folsom, however, much of the reason that a Democratic candidate is able to come into power or gain this position is because part of Folsom is in the same district with Elk Grove. So although Folsom is very conservative, Elk Grove is pretty liberal. Many would argue that this is a reflection of gerrymandering, meaning that the districts have been drawn up to try and favor one political party over the other. In this case, grouping part of Elk Grove or Elk Grove with Folsom would mean that there's a greater chance for a Democrat to gain office. Now, I know we're not in my classroom, but I often ask my students to look at this map of the districts in California and compare that to the county map I have on my wall. They look very different. And when you look at the shapes of the districts, some of them can look very unusual. Again, this may be attributed to gerrymandering, an attempt to try to secure a specific political party's advantage when it comes to winning that district. Now let's look at the Senate's power. The Senate has the power to ratify treaties, confirm judicial and executive appointments, try impeachments placed by the House. That means that the actual trial takes place in the Senate and is presided over by the Chief Justice. They have the power to convict, which is attached to impeachments, and they also have the power to remove someone from office through conviction. As you'll notice, the Senate has much more prestigious powers, and that is because they're considered wiser. They're considered more educated. When we're looking at the time that the bicameral legislature was created, the Senate was considered made up of individuals who were intellectuals, intelligent. They were looking out for the entire state as a whole, not their local communities. If you look at the way the House is made up, it's a lot easier for any Joe Schmo to potentially get a position because all they have to be is likable enough to their local communities. The Senate, however, is made up of individuals and representatives that have to appeal to their entire state. Again, they're looking out for their state, not local communities. And for this reason, the fact that they're not as connected to the people means they might be able to base their decisions on education and on what might be best for the general welfare, even though the people may not necessarily agree. Now, the influence on Senate has changed quite a bit throughout history. Prior to the 17th Amendment, the Senate was actually made up of individuals that were appointed by their state legislatures. So the states could choose individuals that they felt would be more favorable to their interests. Today, however, and after the 17th Amendment was passed, the Senate is now elected by popular vote. That means that there might be more impact and influence from the people in who their senators may be. Again, let's recap why the Senate has this power. They're considered a more experienced body. Remember, they serve 6-year terms as opposed to 2-year terms. They're less affected by public opinion, especially prior to the popular vote and prior to the 17th Amendment getting passed. They're also more of a reflection of state interests rather than district interests. So they're not that they're not so much on a tight leash as you would consider your House of Representatives. The next major concept we're going to be looking at is federalism and whether or not the federal government has grown too big. What's your opinion? Has the federal government grown too big, or is the federal government not doing enough? One thing that cannot be disputed is the fact that federal power has expanded over time. Some see this expansion of federal power as being a benefit to the country, and others consider it a hindrance. Let's look at some of the ways the federal government has been able to expand over time. The first reason is the federal government's ability to tax and spend. The first imposed income tax was instituted in 1861, and since then, the federal government has been taking money out of our paychecks. Some people think that this is a good thing because it ensures that we have access to programs, opportunities, and services that we otherwise would not. Others feel like they'd be able to make better decisions for themselves with that money to increase their livelihoods. Ultimately, more money means more power, and the ability to tax and spend allowed for the federal government to pave the way for more federal power. This money created more authority. And so when we think of certain programs that have been instituted by the federal government, we think of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and defense spending. Again, a lot of people think that the tax money that is used for these programs are beneficial. They help individuals feel more secure. It's a safety net. At the same time, they feel protected. Others just see money coming out of their paychecks, and they feel pretty resentful for that. How many of you have jobs where you look at your paycheck and you see how much money is coming out of taxes? Do you complain about those taxes? Think about what those taxes are used for. Do you agree with what they're used for? Do you disagree with what they're used for? Maybe you agree with what some of it's used for, and you disagree with what other things that money might be used for. Another major expansion of the federal government and federal power comes from the Elastic Clause. Now, the Elastic Clause is also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause. It comes from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 of the Constitution. And so the reason it's called the Elastic Clause is because of the flexibility that it gives Congress in being able to implement policies. These implemented policies are often very controversial because states feel that it's overstepping their authority to create those laws. The text in the Constitution reads, "The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof." This loose language has allowed for Congress to consider policies that are beneficial to the general welfare of the people. And again, because that can be perceived very differently by many people throughout the country, and especially when it comes to states versus federal power and authority, that can get pretty complicated. The part of the Constitution that this presents the biggest controversy is the 10th Amendment. That 10th Amendment was tacked on to the Bill of Rights as a way to secure states in feeling as though the federal government would not become too powerful. So if these laws, or this authority, I should say, was not delegated as a power to the federal government and it wasn't included in the Constitution, it would be assumed that the states had that authority. Well, this Necessary and Proper Clause makes it pretty broad and makes for a lot of flexibility for Congress to be able to make different decisions that they think they have the authority over to do or make. The next aspect of the Constitution that also helped expand federal power would be the Commerce Clause. This was discussed in Wickard versus Filburn in Constitution USA that you watched last Friday. This refers to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Now, the main component of this, obviously, is that if an economic activity may impact more than one state, the federal government may step in and feel that it has the authority to be able to create laws, regulations, and policies that intervene with that and try to solve maybe some of those disputes, issues, or problems. And so again, it may be at the benefit of one state and at the detriment of another. And so again, this is where it can get really conflicted, but at the same time,